I just want to say this very much right now. As recently as the summer of 2017, Houston Chronicle had an article concerning an outstanding balance associated with housing bonds that had been acquired, that had been financed under certain terms, and that had been intended for specific kinds of investment in the city of Houston. They had an article, a very comprehensive investigation they had done concerning these outstanding housing bonds and the refusal to appropriately account for them before not only Hurricane Harvey, but also before Tropical Storm Cynthia, which nobody talks about. Tropical Storm Cynthia preceded Hurricane Harvey. And we're going to get into that as soon in the very near future. But the point of the matter is, there were already two declarations of states of emergency in the state of Texas. And two declarations of states of emergency. But before either of those declarations of states of emergency in the state of Texas concerning weather-related phenomena, there was a very comprehensive investigation by the Houston Chronicle that was publicly published. It was a part of a number of organizations contributing and criticizing the administration of the city of Houston concerning that bond issue. And this came at a time when the city council was going through an overhaul of the flood mitigation strategy, which also would have had to have appropriately accounted for what it meant that they were implementing the decisions and the policy that they were intending to embark upon when it came to their specific flood mitigation plan. It changes to the floodplain, including the areas that were recharacterized as being in a 50-year floodplain versus a 100-year floodplain. How that marked out in the city, including in juxtaposition to other kinds of water elements or other things that might be influenced by a flood overall. They had spent a very substantial amount of time investing city resources into that strategy. And I bring that up because now, presumably, there's such a horrible situation confronting Texas. We're going to need what? How much more aid? And even if you're talking about identifying particular people or entities in order to crack down on matters related to some sort of malfeasance or some sort of misappropriation, I've been watching actively for the last 3 years specifically, going on for 3 specific years when I've actually been reading and looking at the bond notices, but tracking public information about changes to municipal policy in Houston, in Pasadena, Texas, in Austin, in Dallas, in Fort Worth that I've been on site for. And there's all sorts of other communities. Hutto, San Antonio, Plano, just to name a few. Corpus Christi. These are all cities within the state of Texas that have had to go through some very serious consideration around local investment, including investment in fixed assets that are public assets or public works, like their water management systems, like things having to do with, I don't know, whatever happened to those stadium bonds for Arlington. There's a variety of already committed to obligations around financing for both fixed assets and other services within particular municipalities. And I've been watching for years how there was misrepresentation of the terms of the financiability of the area of concern, mostly related to a refusal to follow through on investigations of fraud. And in conjunction with that fraud, to actually prosecute people for committing crime. I'm not talking about a penalty that can be recirculated as a cost of doing business and offset with a temporary hiring of certain people that don't make enough money to get out of a particular tax incentive that then allows for a particular zone to be designated in a manner that gives a company a tax write-off. You don't have enough revenue coming in. And because you don't have enough revenue coming in, people are exploiting the fact that nobody has actually followed through on assuring that the financing for these areas is accurate. And so you have all of these outstanding obligations that were intentionally, fraudulently engaged. And in the meantime, what's been happening? What's been happening with the sewer systems? What's been happening with the waste treatment plants? What's been happening with the schools? No, let me ask you a question. What's been happening with the technology centers, including those associated with the schools? What's been happening with the transportation system and the bonds around the transportation system, which would also include what? I don't know, like the tollways and the automatic features concerning the tollways. All of that would have been a very significant part of an accurate assessment of the viability of the grid. How many cities in Texas are already so called 5G? How many cities have already gone through the processes of allegedly upgrading to 5G? How many more are slated? All of those would have required some sort of investment, both locally, that would have been supported by other aspects, including the state and including the federal government. You cannot talk about how there's a problem with the grid in Texas. You cannot talk about how Texas was unprepared until you're honest about what's really going on with 5G. And that's the whole thing here. If you're trying to cover up for the fact that allegations of COVID-19 being connected to speculation on the rollout of 5G didn't go the way you promised people they would, and instead you're trying to characterize it in one manner, then you're going to have to deal with the ramifications and the implications of what it means when that gets exposed. We have a big problem in Texas. People pay their way out of getting busted. And in the meantime, they lean on the people and try to keep the people quiet about actual crime and extort them into cooperating with actual crime as insurance to cover up for the criminals. That is not sustainable. These shortcuts that have been taken, these refusals to actually follow through on allegations of fraud, including fraud in connection with fraudulent municipal bond issues that were mischaracterized at the onset because of acts of fraud and corruption going on in the municipality that haven't been attended to, are the prime area you need to be focusing on, rather than just trying to find another token shaming. That you're going to do what? Are you going to assess them fines? Are you going to fine these agencies? Are you going to lean on the administrative processes associated with those agencies as a way to offset default through the judicial branch? See, all of these are things that have already been on the horizon, specifically to the state of Texas, but not exclusively. The state has engaged in recurring processes where it's refused to do what it needed to do to meet its obligations concerning very important sectors, including the State Bar of Texas and the Texas Insurance Commission, just to name two. And you're already in a state of default where you had to report in and you had to follow up on things in order to make sure those things are backed up. You are not going to get away with trying to exploit this situation we're in now to target a few people in a tokenistic manner in order to allow for the realization of what was ultimately this long-term scheme around trying to cover up for how the energy sector, specifically the gas and oil sector, intentionally engaged in taking on obligations it did not have any intention of honoring, because it had every intention of trying to offset the default in order to use it for all these other things that you've been setting up as part of their market transformation. After we've all been attempted for social engineering to being so desperate and so emergency relief laden that we'll go through with it? I don't think so. I don't think so. You should have already attended to the crime and corruption. These are criminal matters. These are criminal matters. This is not about assessing a civil penalty or performing some sort of, a pecuniary sort of admonishment in order to try to deflect the righteous indignation of people that are suffering and cover up for the established network that had every intention of getting away with this. You're not going to be able to do that. This is the situation that we're in right now. If this is the result and the culmination of the refusal to actually address the fraud in the graft, if it's really as serious as you want everybody to think it is, then why? How was it allowed to get this serious? This is not just about a particular area. You already knew that the whole situation with the lack of regulation was an intentional effort to cover up for organized criminal activity in other areas. Now's the time you're going to have to confront that. You don't have any other options.